We want members to see our current board members, so we ask one board member to introduce a speaker each month. And this month, Jen Savino, who is on the second of a 2-year term on our board and chair of our Community Grants Committee and the Ad Hoc Grants Committee, will make the introduction. Jen rejoined our Rotary Club in 2018, and she is CEO and co-owner of KW2, a digital and advertising agency. And Jen will now introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Charles. Glad to be here today. I'm so pleased to welcome our speaker, New York Times bestseller David Maraniss, and he welcomed me to pronounce it however I choose. So we'll see at the end of the day whether or not it was correct. We're welcoming him back to Rotary today to talk about his latest book, Path Lit by Lightning: The Life of Jim Thorpe, which was released last month. David is a UW-Madison graduate and began his career as a reporter for the Madison Cap Times. He has been affiliated with the Washington Post for more than 40 years as an editor and writer, and has twice won Pulitzer Prizes for the newspaper. In 1993, he received a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for his coverage on Bill Clinton, and in 2007 he was part of a team that won a Pulitzer for coverage on the Virginia Tech shooting. He has won many awards, just to name a few: the George Polk Award, the Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize, the Anthony Lucas Book Prize, and the Frankfurt E-Book Award. So we're offering a convenient way for you to buy your copy of the book, more convenient than Amazon, and that is at our table here. They're available to purchase after David's presentation. So we look forward to your presentation, and in honor of that, we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thank you for speaking to us today. I also wanted to mention that we will have Q&A after his presentation, but please wait for the microphone before you start asking questions. So let's welcome David up to the podium.
Thank you, Jen. It's nice to be among so many friends and back in Madison. My wife and I got back here about 8 days ago, and it's just such a blessing to come back to our hometown. As I've said before, Madison holds such a special place in my heart and in my family's, because this town was a salvation for my family and my father, after he'd been sort of hounded during the Red Scare, and everything changed from there. And so coming back is both a joy personally for myself and my wife Linda. We met at West High School 55 years ago, still married. It's been quite a wonderful ride, and just to be back here means everything to both of us. I wanted to say a few things about the Capital Times and what it's meant to my family. I'm not only hiring my father, but giving my start in journalism. And as part of my payback for that, I've tried to help every year with the Capital Times Idea Fest, which will be this September. And once again, we're bringing in some amazing people, including Judy Woodruff from PBS and her husband, Al Hunt, and Jonathan Eig and his brilliant new book on Martin Luther King, and having a discussion with the Chancellor and your old Mayor Paul Soglin and the law school dean about freedom of speech and its importance in American life right now, and many other great speakers. I also want to thank the Capital Times for honoring my father, and the EVU Foundation, again this year, gave a really generous donation to the scholarship at the University of Wisconsin, which I set up in honor of my dad to try to help bring in more women and minority students into journalism. And so they did another generous donation. So thank you, Paul, for that. This book came out 11 months ago in hardback and just last month in paperback, but I've been speaking about it so long that, I'm afraid everybody's heard my rap. When I mentioned that at the table, and no offense to anybody here, the response was, well, don't worry, these are old people, they won't remember anyway. And it reminded me of sort of, picking up a book and halfway through remembering you'd already read it once before. But Jim Thorpe came to me, actually, in a sense, more than 20 years ago. I was on a book tour in Denver, talking about my book, They Marched into Sunlight. And at the end of the event, a gentleman came up to me and introduced himself as Norbert Hill, a member of the Oneida Nation from Wisconsin. And he handed me a sheaf of papers and said, David, here's your next book. And I politely said, thank you. I never take suggestions from anybody else. It has to come organically from within myself. And I'm working on another book about Roberto Clemente, but I took the papers and I think lost them. But he planted a seed that took a long time to grow, but it did. And as I was finishing another book, I started thinking about how I'd done 2 sports biographies about figures who transcended sports. First being Vince Lombardi, when pride still mattered, and then Roberto Clemente. And in both cases, I was looking for something that used the drama and action of sports to write about American history and sociology. So for Lombardi, it was not just about leadership and about his brilliant record as a Packer coach, but also about the mythology of competition and success in American life, what it takes and what it costs. For Clemente, it was not just this beautiful ball player, my favorite when I was a kid. I once was invited to speak in Milwaukee at Hank Aaron's foundation. And of course, I grew up, like many of you, with the Milwaukee Braves, and Aaron and Matthews and Sponny were my heroes. But during that speech, I was talking about Clemente, and I said, no offense, Mr. Aaron, you were one of my heroes, but the Milwaukee Braves could have signed Roberto Clemente, and if they had, you would have been playing left field. And he said, yeah, you're right. But anyway, Clemente, more than just a beautiful ball player, was that rare athlete. So many athletes are called heroes and very few really are, and Clemente really was. His motto was, if you have a chance to help others and fail to do so, you're wasting your time on this earth. And he died living out that motto, trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua after the earthquake on New Year's Eve, 1972, when he boarded a plane that was egregiously overloaded, and it crashed into the ocean, and he died. A true hero. And then I was thinking about, how could I make this into a trilogy of sports figures who have some larger meaning? And Jim Thorpe came back to me, the seed that Norbert Hill had planted. Thorpe, inarguably, was a brilliant world-class athlete, in the argument for the greatest athlete ever. No one did what he did, the trifecta of being an All-American football player, the first great professional football player, the first president of what became the National Football League, a gold medalist at the Stockholm Olympics in the decathlon and pentathlon, and a Major League Baseball player. No one has done all 3 of those things. He was also a great hockey player, a great swimmer, ballroom dancer champion. He was even good at marbles. So, in terms of all-around greatness, few can compare to Jim Thorpe. But that's not why I wrote the book. I saw in his life a chance to explore the Native American experience. And that's really what the book is about. The drama of his incredible athletic achievements are just a way to move the story along, to explore what it meant to be an indigenous person in this country from the time he was born in 1887 to the time he died in 1953. Those 2 years, just by coincidence, as so often happens when I start researching something, were seminal years in the history of how this government treated Native Americans. The year he was born, 1887, was the year Congress passed the Dawes Act, which was an attempt to take away the communal properties of all the Native nations and turn them into private landowners. In other words, try to make them follow the white society's norms. And it was a rigged system in which millions of acres of Native lands were taken away from them. 1953 was the year of the passage in Congress of a Detribalization Act, again trying to take away the natives, their culture and their land and their meaning. Luckily, that didn't last for long. But those were the 2 years of bracketing Jim Thorpe's life. In between, the seminal moments of his life were played out at government-run Indian boarding schools. First in the territory of Oklahoma, from which he came. He was born along the North Canadian River in May of 1887, and there was a thunderstorm that night of his birth. He was born a twin with another brother, Charlie, and because of the lightning storm, his mother named him Wathohuk, which poetically is translated into Path Lit by Lightning, the title of my book. He went off to the Sack and Fox boarding school in nearby Stroud, Oklahoma. His twin brother died there when a disease swept through the boarding school. Jim ran away several times, didn't want to be part of that system. Was sent then to Kansas to the Haskell Institute, another Indian boarding school. Ran away from that. Finally, his father, Hiram Thorpe, who was kind of a roustabout, ne'er-do-well guy, had 5 wives and 20 children, sold bootleg whiskey from the back of a wagon, but was the strongest person that Jim Thorpe said he ever encountered in his life. He would tell stories about going deer hunting with his dad when Jim was 8 or 9 years old, and they'd walk 20 miles, and his dad would shoot 2 deer, put one on each shoulder, and walk back 20 miles. He played against a lot of the great football players of all time, but he said his father was stronger than any of them. In any case, his dad finally said, well, I'm going to send you so far away, you can't run away, back home. And he went to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was the flagship Indian boarding school. It was founded in 1879 by an ex-military man whose motto was, kill the Indian, save the man. The whole notion was that rather than have the quote-unquote Indian wars of the late 1900s, of the middle 1800s, they would just acculturate through forced assimilation the native peoples into white culture. The first Native kids who were sent to the boarding school were actually Lakota Sioux, who were the children of the Indians who fought Custer. And so they tamed them, they killed them, but as Indians, but saved them as people. It was, as is so often the case throughout history and American history, something that was formed by what people thought were good intentions that served an ill purpose. Jim Thorpe arrived there in 1904. Unbelievably, he was 16 years old, and he stood 5'5" and weighed 115 pounds. When you look at the photo on the jacket of the book, it's only a few years later. He grew incredibly over the course of that time at Carlisle. It too was a rigged system where many of the students were sent to Carlisle. The school got money from the government and then sent the students off to work in the farms of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. getting minimal pay there as indentured servants, essentially. So the school was sort of double billing and using the students. Jim Thorpe did that for 3 years, finally came back in 1907. And the story, there's so many mythological stories about Jim Thorpe, some that sports writers told and some that he would repeat himself. One of my favorites is when he said that once playing baseball, he hit home runs into 3 separate states. He was playing in Texarkana, Texas, he said. He hit one into Texas, one into Arkansas, and one into Oklahoma. He did hit 3 home runs that day, but Oklahoma was 23 miles away. So, anyway, fat chance. But another one of the stories, which sounds apocryphal but is actually true, is that Thorpe was working on the farm at the school in 1907 in the spring, wearing overalls and boots, and walked by the athletic fields and saw some of the students, the athletes, trying to clear the high jump bar at 6 feet, and they couldn't do it. And Thorpe, in the overalls and boots, easily cleared the bar. The next day, he was on the track team. And pretty soon, he was on the football team and becoming the greatest athlete, not just at Carlisle, but in the country. So that by 1912, his athletic prowess took him to Stockholm, where he won those gold medals, competing in 17 events in 2 weeks. And it's impossible, really, or futile to compare athletes from different generations, and especially the decathlon, where the whole scoring system has changed, but also because of the differences in training and nutrition. Everything is different from generation to generation. But Thorpe, in winning that decathlon, defeated his opponents by a greater margin than anyone in history. He went back to Carlisle for his senior season at football, and not only was an All-American, but was the star of a game that I call the greatest act of athletic retribution in American history. It was the Indians against the Army on a level playing field at last. One of the players for the Army was a young linebacker and fullback named Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had, and all the Army players knew that Thorpe was the best player in the country. And football has always been a violent sport. It was even more violent and dirty then. So Ike and one of his teammates conspired before the game that they would knock Thorpe out by hitting him high and low at the same time. And they kept trying to get him, and finally in the third quarter they succeeded. Thorpe was on the ground groggy for about a minute, and then he got up and kept playing and knocked Eisenhower out of the game. And Eisenhower never played football again. But the Indians won that game 27-6. And it was a shaking of the bones, as the great novelist and poet and Scott Momaday wrote about it. Thorpe's life after that went into professional football when it was a scraggly game. It was even before the Packers joined the league, before it was the National Football League. He was the star of professional football. In the first class that was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He played baseball for many years, never got the shot that he deserved. He was mismanaged by a Hall of Fame manager, John McGraw of the Giants. Only got to play really one great year when he was traded to the Boston Braves and led the league in hitting for almost the entire year. And then was sent off to the minors again. So in any case, he struggled like so many athletes. You know, the poem an ode to an athlete dying young. Most athletes, even if they stay alive, in a sense die young because their greatest years are behind them often in their mid-30s. Thorpe had the particular struggle of not only dealing with that, losing his athletic prowess, but also dealing with his own demons. He struggled with alcoholism and with society and the way it was treating him. He bounced around from city to city, lived in 20 different cities over the course of the rest of his life, took on various jobs ranging from being a greeter or a bouncer in a tavern to working for the Chicago Parks Department. Probably the most meaningful part of his post-athletic life was spent out in Los Angeles, where he worked on the fringes of the studio industry for more than a decade, and he became the spokesperson for about 200 Native Americans who wanted to be in acting and thought they should get the jobs in all of the westerns that were being filmed when the studios were hiring white guys and putting war paint on them. And Thorpe said, "Hire us." And he also spoke out against the disparaging ways that most of those movies, not all, portrayed indigenous peoples. So that was a meaningful part of his life, but he just kept trying to get the job that he wanted as a coach or as running a hunting and fishing lodge. You know, when people would ask him what his favorite sport was, he'd say hunting and fishing, even though he was great at everything else. But it never happened. And he died in 1953 at age 65 of a heart attack in a trailer park in Southern California. As I was writing the last many chapters of the book, I kept rooting for something better to happen, knowing that, of course, it wasn't. I'd already researched everything. And that got me thinking, you know, in a more deeper way about why I wrote the book in the first place and what the larger meaning of Jim Thorpe was. There's a moment in 1915 when the most popular statue in America was called The End of the Trail, and it portrayed an Indian slumped on horseback with a horse slumped. It's so popular that it's been replicated all over the country. There's even a version of it in Wausau, Wisconsin. And the notion was that it was all over, that it was the end of the race, that manifest destiny had prevailed, and the Indian race was dying and would soon be dead. And it didn't happen. At that point, there were only about 300,000 Native Americans left in this country, after there had been untold millions before the Europeans arrived. But slowly over the next century, for all of the troubles that the Native Americans faced from the government, on the reservations, dealing with poverty and various forms of abuse and so many other unfair treatments, they managed to survive, and they're now a few million. The kill the Indian, save the man never happened. The Indian heritage was never killed. There's as much going on today in terms of trying to revive the culture and heritage and religion of the native peoples than ever. The whole notion of the Indian boarding schools is getting a deeper look from Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, from the government in Canada, after the Pope went there and apologized for the way the Catholic schools were treating the Indians in the First Nation people in the boarding schools there. At the Carlisle Indian Boarding School today, it's now the Army War College. And the most haunting sight there is a cemetery of all the young kids who died while they were there. Row after row, a few hundred. And only in the last few years, many of the Indian nations, including the Oneida here in Wisconsin and the Ojibwa, have been able to finally go back and repatriate those kids who died. And that's part of the other meaning of this. It was not the end of the trail, and Jim Thorpe, in his way, was not a tragedy, as the white society so often tries to portray it, but a lesson in perseverance for himself and his entire people. Thank you very much. Of course, the first question would come from Levitan.
Welcome back, David, and thank you for coming. Could you say something about the myths and misunderstandings of his time at the Olympics in Stockholm, and especially the role of Avery Brundage in his story?
Well, yeah, there's so many things I didn't talk about in this book, but, Jim Thorpe's life was defined by loss in many ways. The loss of land, the loss of his twin brother at boarding school, the loss of his parents before he was 16, the loss of his youngest son, Jim Jr., age 3, during the influenza of 1918, and most significantly in terms of his athletic career, the loss of his gold medals. And Avery Brundage was part of that. Avery Brundage has been a villain in 2 of my books and 1 of my son's books. You can't think of a more despicable human being. He was the head of the International Olympic Committee for decades, and during that entire time refused to acknowledge that Thorpe was unjustly treated when the medals were taken away from him. Brundage didn't really have anything to do with it originally. As a matter of fact, shockingly to me, when I started researching the book, I realized that Brundage was at those 1912 Olympics as a decathlete. I always thought of him as this fat cat plutocrat, sort of smoking cigars and living in fancy European hotels and collecting Asian art and having various mistresses, all of which was true. But also, in a younger age, he was a decathlete, and he was a mediocre one at best. But he did get on that team, and he was being trounced by Thorpe so much during the decathlon in Stockholm that he dropped out after 8 events. This man who kept saying it's not important what nation you represent or how you do, it's just the playing of the games. He couldn't take it when Thorpe crushed him. So that's probably one of the reasons why for the rest of his life, as he rose up the ladder of the IOC, he refused to give Thorpe his justice. But there were 2 other powerful men in 1912 who were most responsible for Thorpe unjustly having his medals taken away. One was another well-known person in the athletic world. 2, both of them were. The first was Pop Warner. Some of you have heard of Pop Warner football. Well, Pop Warner was the coach at Carlisle, and when a story appeared that said that Thorpe had played minor league baseball in eastern North Carolina for 2 summers, meaning that he had played professionally, and his amateurism was in question, and he would lose his gold medals because of that, Warner lied and said he didn't know anything about it. He essentially trying to save his own reputation, when in fact he knew everything that Thorpe was doing, and he had been responsible for Indian athletes going to play summer baseball for years before that. There's so much more I could say, Stu, but I'll let people read the book to see all of the ways that it was unjust, and Avery Brundage and Pop Warner were a key part of that.
James Ty from Clean Lakes Alliance. Thank you very much for your talk today. In your comments today, you have used the word First Nations, Indigenous, Native American, and Indian. In your research, can you tell this group how those all words are interchangeable, and because over such a long period of time, what those words mean for you, or what you learned in your research about First Nations, Indigenous, and all the other ones?
I try to meet people where they are, but also to meet history where it is. And so for all of Thorpe's life, they were called Indians, or worse, Redskins. Thorpe was always called chief, even though he was never a chief. He was always on the warpath taking scalps, all of the stereotypes. As I was researching the book, the first thing I did was consult with many Native American scholars, including the great Patty Lowe from here, who was then at Northwestern, and she was very encouraging, and I talked to her a lot. Suzanne Harjo, who is a Native activist in Washington, D.C., primarily the main figure in getting that horrible owner of the Washington football team to change the name of that team. Norbert Hill, the first person who advised me to do it. And essentially, those phrases, those descriptions aren't interchangeable, but they can be used at different times for different reasons. And so none of those are disparaging, but some people prefer one to the other. The name of the museum in Washington is the National Museum of the American Indian. American Indian, was the name chosen by the activists who took over Wounded Knee. So it depends on the era, the feeling at that moment, and I'm always trying to meet the right time and place for it.
Fred Marshall. And is it true that Jim used to put iron thigh pads? They said he hit so hard when you try to tackle him and then he was accused of putting iron thigh pads in his football.
That's a great question, Fred. It's a myth. It was just that his body was that strong and tough that people thought he was wearing it in his shoulder pads too. He wasn't even wearing shoulder pads. So yeah, that's so many of those. He was tough, and he did. Football is like that, but no, he did not wear, and he didn't do any of that. It was just his body, and nobody wanted to try to tackle him. He was a runaway horse going downhill. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Very well done. And what a great way to kick off our year, right? Thank you for spending time with us. I invite you to come next week to hear from UW Professor Marcus Brower, who will talk about changes to behaviors in diversity. So it should be another really interesting program. And I would like to end each meeting throughout the year by reciting the four-way test. So if you would please stand, and we will recite the four-way test of the things we think, do, and say. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? We are adjourned.